Presentation, and thank you, Kevin, for that fireside chat. Now it's time for our second panel, and this one is on infrastructure, communication, water and utilities, power and gas. As Kevin described earlier today, infrastructure is critical to any rebuild. We need to start from the ground up, obviously, and power, water, gas, fiber, wireless infrastructure are all critical to providing any kind of a meaningful rebuild situation. Here today to moderate the panel is Jesus Roman. Jesus currently serves as the Verizon's Chief Regulatory and Legislative Counsel, overseeing proceedings at public utility commissions and legislatures across 8 western United States. He leads the local government affairs and corporate social responsibility initiatives throughout Southern California. He coordinates the development of public policy positions on key issues including public safety, resilience, consumer protection, and climate protection. And in addition, he and his team drive Latino engagement across Southern California, ensuring the community's voice is represented. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce my colleague and, I'm very honored to say, my very good friend, Jesus Roman. Jesus.
Well, thank you for that, Rex. So again, my name is Jesus Roman. I'm Chief Regulatory and Legislative Counsel, and I do community engagement and local engagement in Southern California. I've been with Verizon for 22 years, going on 23 years now, so I'm aging myself here a little bit. But what I want to do is let you know that this particular panel has to do with utilities, and there's going to be a couple of themes that I'm going to hit on. Number one, obviously, is how specifically were the particular utilities impacted due to the fires? And then second is what kind of technologies, new technologies, can they bring to bear for rebuilding their technologies? So I'm going to start off with asking Scott Longhurst, the Director of Government Relations from Counsel, to come up, take a seat. Any order. Maria Ventura from the she's the Regional Public Affairs Manager for SoCal Gas. Maria. You came to say hi, and I didn't say hi earlier. Hola.
I love the correction.
Shane Chapman, the General Manager of Operations for the Metropolitan Water District. Are you here, Shane? There you are. It's good to meet you in person, sir.
It's a pleasure.
And then Brandon Tolentino, I hope I pronounced that right, Director, Distribution Engineering for SoCal Edison. And here he comes. Pleasure to meet you, Brandon. All right, so I'm going to ask each of them, just go down the road, starting from Scott, say a little bit about yourself. No more than 2 minutes, please. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Scott Longhurst. As Jesus indicated, I'm the Senior External Affairs Manager for Counsel here in Southern California. Crown is one of those companies that many of you probably have not heard of, but we do a lot of work behind the scenes. We're the nation's largest owner-operator of what we call shared telecommunications infrastructure. That's a mouthful to those of you that are not in this industry, but essentially what we do is we own and operate telecommunications assets across the country. We're organized as a real estate investment trust, so many of you that are in the development community are organized similarly. Instead of owning office buildings or apartment buildings, we own telecom assets. And so we own a portfolio of 40,000 towers across the United States. We make those available primarily to the big four telecommunications, wireless carriers, but we also host local emergency responders, public safety agencies, really TV stations, anybody who wants to use our facilities for their broadcasting needs. We also operate a fiber network that consists of about 105,000 miles of fiber in the 30 or 40 metropolitan markets across the U.S. And we're a big player in the small cell space. So we've worked with our carrier partners to build over 100,000 small cells across the United States. And those are really used by the carriers for infill purposes in areas where we have congestion on the network or we need additional capacity and coverage. So that's who we are, and I'll pass it over to Brandon.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Shane Chapman, Assistant General Manager of Operations, Metropolitan Water District. For those not familiar, Metropolitan is the regional wholesaler. So we serve water through 26 member agencies in 6 counties here in Southern California. We bring that water in from the Colorado River Aqueduct and from the State Water Project through a contract with the State Department of Water Resources. Our role during the January fires was to provide mutual aid to the water utilities that were impacted. And here this afternoon to share some of that experience with you and offer some observations. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you to BizFed.
Good afternoon, Brandon Tolentino. I am the Director of Distribution Engineering for Southern California Edison. For those that don't know, we serve the Altadena area as well as the Malibu area that was affected by the Palisades fire. I'm currently the lead for our restoration and rebuild efforts in both areas, so I've been on the ground since January 6th and 7th as we prepared for the windstorms and as we are rebuilding both of those areas. Thank you.
Hello, I'm honored to be here today and be on this panel and also join my co-panelists here and learn more about their infrastructure investments and how they also manage the wildfire response. My name is again Maria Ventura. I'm the Regional Public Affairs Manager, and in that role at SoCal Gas, I lead the public affairs team in the Los Angeles area. A little bit about SoCal Gas is we run the largest natural gas utility in the United States with 100,000 miles of pipeline stemming from the Fresno area to the Mexican border along the Central Coast. And our role during the wildfires, like many of my co-panelists here, is immediately when the fire began, we started monitoring. Of course, we're paying attention. We proactively activated our Emergency Operations Center, and I personally served at that and still continue to serve in that function. Also, we deployed over 1,000 personnel to respond, and I'm proud to say 3 of those individuals also are joining me here today. That's Olga Quiñones, Linnell Shields, and also Gabby Medina, because we all know we all need to work together, and that includes within SoCal Gas and also external partners. So I'm excited to hear this discussion, and thank you.
Thank you very much. Everyone out in the audience, I'm sure that the one thing that you don't want to have experience, especially all at the same time, is to lose all of your utilities, right? I mean, do you want to have a situation where you can't communicate because you don't have cell phone service or you don't have landline service, you don't have gas, you don't have water, you don't have electricity? Those things have happened to a lot of people. I came from a country where that happened often, like it was almost every single day. I grew up in Puerto Rico. So we're blessed in California to have really, really good utilities. And I think you would all imagine that some of these utilities went out during the fires. There wasn't just the Eaton and the Palisades fires. There was about 11 different fires going on at the same time. And it impacted throughout the entire territory. So my first question to you is if you can provide some specificity as to what exactly was damaged in either your utility or if you represent another utility, series of utilities, what was it that was harmed or damaged? And I'm going to have other questions around that. So let's go reverse order first, please, Maria.
So most of the infrastructure SoCal Gas owns and operates is underground. So we fare well when it comes to natural disasters. So that being said, we're ready to serve and restore service to residents as they are able to do so. So proactively, we did disconnect service to 32,000 residents in support of wildfire response. But I will say what was damaged, of course, because of the size of the natural disaster, there was always going to be some impacts. Our meters, some of our risers, but again, our mains were intact.
Yeah, for us, we saw pretty significant damage. If you've seen video, if you've been out to the areas, there was significant damage in both areas. So, we spent a lot of time in January getting restoration up to the customers that we could. But that was only, a small percentage, probably 30% of the customers in those areas, because the rest either had severely damaged homes or their homes and businesses were no longer there. So we're in the middle of rebuilding, and, when you look at any utility's response, we're really good at responding quickly, getting service back as quick as possible. And This time we had to take a step back and say, there's a lot to do here. We need to think about how the community is going to rebuild. Let's take a step back and not, put all the poles up and put all the wire in the air. So we paused, and it's taking us a little bit longer, but we're trying to make sure that we are in front of all the rebuild that the customers will be doing, whether it's a business or a home. But we're also making sure that we're building back better as we do that. And we heard that from the other panel. How do we build the areas and the communities back stronger than they were before? So really taking a step back, thinking about the community as a whole and not street by street, neighborhood by neighborhood, and looking at what opportunities there are to build back better, build back stronger, more resilient, more reliable for the customers, so that when they do come back and when the community, as the community rebuilds, they can expect more reliable service, they can expect a better experience for themselves.
So Brandon, before we go on, can you give us a sense for the magnitude of the number of poles that burn down that you have to replace, and the magnitude of the number of miles of conductors that were overhead? That I know there's pressure now to put everything underground, but for whatever was overhead, how many miles did Southern California Edison lose in all the fires?
Yeah, I believe our pole count, it continues to shift and change as we rebuild, right? But it's somewhere on the order of 1,800 to 2,000 poles that were damaged in both areas. And something about 800,000 feet of conductor. So a significant amount of work that needed to happen. And like I said, we're still doing some of that work as some of the areas rebuild.
Thank you. Shane?
Yeah, fortunately for Metropolitan, we did not have any damage to our infrastructure. As a large regional wholesaler, much like gas, most of our infrastructure is concrete. It's buried. It's fairly well protected and very resilient to wildfire. We did have a pressure control structure off of the 405 freeway in the Sepulveda Pass, just below the Getty Museum, that was very important to supporting the firefight in the Palisades and getting more water and pressure to Los Angeles Department of Water and Power. And Murphy's Law, the fire started to threaten that structure, but the fire service was great in helping us protect that. So that was an important part of the operation. Most of our effort, LADWP and County Public Works are very well-resourced agencies, so most of our effort has been supporting the community, the Altadena Foothill community. There are 7 small water utilities that serve the Altadena community and the La Cañada community. 3 of those were heavily impacted, one to the degree that they lost 70% of the homes that they serve in their area. So just utter devastation there. And the main infrastructure that was damaged, these are older communities, older utilities with reservoirs, some built in the 1930s by the Work Progress Administration. Million-gallon reservoir, concrete structure buried in the ground, but with a wood roof structure with steel on top of it. So when the structures went up around these reservoirs are embedded within these communities, that radiant heat took out 7 of these reservoirs. So that's been our main focus, to support these water utilities, to help them work with FEMA and with the Army Corps of Engineers, get the debris removed, get some interconnections working, get some pressure-reducing valve stations installed for them, so we could get those systems put back together so they can go back into service.
Thank you. So the magnitude of that is quite significant, especially for the Altadena community. So, Scott, I'm going to bless you with the authority to speak for the entire communications industry. So to the extent that you know about not just what Crown Castle lost, but what other communications utilities lost, can you speak to, specifically what you know?
Certainly, and thank you for that. It was pretty devastating to the communications industry, as you can imagine. I mean, similarly to Edison and the power providers, DWP in the city of LA area, a lot of our infrastructure and those of our carrier partners were on wood utility poles. So most, if not all of that, was lost. Crown specifically lost over 50 miles of fiber. We're now collaborating with Edison and the other utilities and the county and the city city. We have weekly phone calls on how we can go about potentially undergrounding a large portion of that. I can tell you, though, that in the interim, between the fire and now, all of the utilities have done a fantastic job of getting their services reestablished. And we at Crown have reestablished all of our fiber services in both Palisades and the Eaton fire zones. But we're supporting the efforts of our carrier partners who are in the midst of now rebuilding a lot of the small cell infrastructure that they lost. The equipment simply melted on the poles. And some of that is being delayed through no fault of their own, really. But again, it's a collaborative effort of working with the other utilities in the cities on what vertical elements are going to be rebuilt in those neighborhoods. So whether if the poles are coming down, for instance, and we're moving everything underground, the small cell node itself is much like the Wi-Fi router in your house. It has to be, up in the air in order to transmit its signal. So we're collaborating on what those new vertical elements are going to be. Are they going to be smart poles? In the city of Los Angeles, we're working on identifying those so that the pole could house multiple users. It could be, a small cell. It could be an EV charging station. It could provide USB ports so people could charge their phones if they're walking more in a downtown kind of environment. So there's lots of opportunity to combine technologies on individual locations, and we're all working, very diligently behind the scenes to do so. But in terms of overall impact, yes, it was a big impact to the telecommunications industry, but we've done a fantastic job, and I have to give kudos to both the city and the county to permitting us to get out there quickly and do that restoration work so that as businesses re-enter these communities, you get contractors going in there. Obviously, everybody's using their cell phones, and so we want to make sure that there's a robust wireless ecosystem in both of these areas to support all the connectivity that's required.
Yeah, thank you. And one of the things that, I'm not sure how much you all know about wireless facilities, but the wireless facilities have to be on poles or, above ground. So any undergrounding efforts to underground antennas is not going to work. But, one of the things that the wireless carriers do is they immediately, once one of their facilities are destroyed, like Verizon had in the Palisades, and a very big, what we call macro, was burnt down. It was on top of a building that burnt down, is we deployed temporary facilities. So if you didn't feel your communications being disrupted for too long, it's because all of us here run to that crisis and deploy these temporary facilities that allow you to continue to have communications. So with that, let me ask you, Scott, let me start with you. And could you tell me, is Crown Castle incorporating new technology or policies to enhance network reliability and improve connectivity in fire-prone areas?
The short answer is yes, and again, we're working closely with their carrier partners. As some of you may or may not be aware, the last couple of years there's been a big push to incorporate 5G technology into all of these facilities. So the bulk of that work has been completed. There are still some areas that need to be upgraded, but that's one of the big improvements I think that all of us will see in the fire zones is those were outdated radios or 4G radios. I shouldn't say outdated. They were just a little latent technology there. They're all going to be upgraded to 5G. So as we come back on air in these areas, you're going to have the latest and greatest wireless technology available to you. Again, we're also going through a hardening process, undergrounding our facilities where we can, where we're permitted to. We're looking at utilizing novel technologies in terms of deploying the fiber. We all recognize that, digging up the streets is a big undertaking. It's very disruptive, takes away on-street parking, lanes of traffic. So we're working with the local jurisdictions, the county, city level, to utilize newer technologies to actually deploy the fiber more quickly with less impact on the streets. And where available, specifically right now along PCH, Topanga Canyon, potentially some other areas, we're collaborating with our utility partners, specifically Edison, and we're using what's called a joint trench. And so if one of the entities, in this case Edison, is going to open up the streets, then they make that available to all the other utilities, and we have the opportunity to place our infrastructure within that joint trench seal it up, and then away we go. So some examples of what we're doing along that line.
All right, thank you. So Maria, I'm going to come to you, and I'm going to ask you two questions. I think they're related. So the first question is, how has SoCal Gas contributed to wildfire recovery efforts? What specific measures have you taken to restore gas service safely? And then that was two questions, but that was really one question. So, and then the next question basically is, what have you done to recover? So that's question number one. The question number two is, what new technologies and practices are you using to reduce fire risks related to gas infrastructure?
Okay. So I think I'm going to kind of condense it a little bit, if you're okay with that, with how have you helped with the recovery process, and then also what infrastructure or kind of innovations are we implementing to make our system a little sturdier. I think that's kind of at the essence of it. So I'll talk about our system first. And again, I just really echo the comments with the other co-panelists. It's as people are living through this traumatic experience, the last thing we want to do as a utility is to delay the opportunity for them to get their service reconnected. So that's always at the forefront. But there is a balance with that. There's also the responsibility to ensure that that reconnection is safe. So that's always kind of the two things that we have to take into account. So what we did, or how we've helped with the recovery of these two wildfires that took place at the same time, is we have patrolled over 100 miles of our natural gas lines to ensure we patrolled them, we inspected them to ensure that they were safe. We also visit individuals' homes, residents, and businesses, and was it safe to reconnect service? So that was one thing we have and still ongoing with that. Also partnering, and I mentioned the Emergency Operations Center, also partnering with our county and city officials. SoCal Gas is also part of these utility coordination calls that are happening with the county, and also different conversations with the city, because it really boils down to two things. Coordination of all our individual utilities, infrastructures, and also working with each other to figure out, okay, if you're going to work on this infrastructure right now, well, maybe we schedule it at a different time, or we're talking about the open trench opportunity, maybe that's the time to work together. So at SoCal Gas, because our main pipelines, our larger pipelines remained undamaged, there isn't a need necessarily for the open trench scenario there. However, as new development happens, as people begin to rebuild and their businesses rebuild, we are open to the opportunity of also joint trench with dry utilities, my fellow colleagues here, co-panelists here on the board. So that's what we've done, but what we continue to do is be forward-thinking. How can we enhance our infrastructure? I did make the comment that our infrastructure is underground, so that does lend itself to fare well during a wildfire. However, everything can always be improved. Everything can be worked on. So one of the things that we're looking at continuously is how do we harden our system? And one of the things could be is excess flow valves at each resident business. So in essence, if there is a predetermined level of pressure within those pipelines, it's an indication that it could be a leak there. So it would automatically shut that service off. So in the occurrence of a wildfire, what have you, just having that happen kind of instantaneously could be beneficial. Also looking at many technologies that other utilities are also exploring and using, and currently using, so is SoCal Gas, drones. How can we also implement that? Satellite, fiber optics. So we have professionals dedicated full-time really looking at this. How can we make our system sturdier? So if there is a silver line to all of this, I think it's a couple of things. All of us collectively looking at our systems, how can we harden them? But just the collective, right? How can we make our city safer as we move forward? Because the point isn't to rebuild as to what it was, let's make it better. And just to add a couple of thoughts, another component of just helping with the recovery process is also some of the philanthropic giving. We've donated over $1 million to different entities. And again, it goes to organizations that are helping businesses. Well, I'll give an example of the Palisades Malibu Chamber. And a statement that their executive director had made was, the businesses are still standing. but nobody's patronizing them. So yes, emergency funds needed to go to those businesses, because the last thing we wanted, any one of us really wants to happen is, yeah, they survived, right? But now they're going to fold because nobody's patronizing them. So it's also just kind of what SoCal Gas always does, is being in the community and working with our neighbors.
Thank you. Thank you. So, Brandon, I'm looking at the time here, and I want to get 2 more questions in before I get the Q&A. But I want to know what Edison is doing to integrate artificial intelligence into its network for rebuilding purposes.
Yeah, that's a great question. So, what we've learned through the process, and some of the silver lining of what we've gone through is, what Scott talked about, what Maria talked about, is just the amount of coordination that has happened that typically doesn't happen for utility work. Like, we always think about our own area of responsibility and we go, right? And I give, a lot of credit to the city and county for helping pull us together. And Scott mentioned it, we meet weekly about what we are doing to build back better together, right? And coordinating on when we're doing that. So a lot of it comes down to sharing data, and we're at a place where 10, 15 years ago, there was too much data. We couldn't do anything with it. But now we have things like machine learning and AI, where we can just, inundate a computer system with information and help it, use it to help us give, a vision of what it needs to look like. How do we digest all this information and use it in a positive manner? It's stuff that we're thinking about in terms of our long-term vision of what the grid needs to look like 20, 30, 40 years from now. We believe Altadena and the area we're rebuilding in Malibu is sort of a microcosm of what the grid could look like 20 years from now, right? So how do we build those areas and test out what we believe we need to put in those areas now? Scott mentioned more fiber, 5G wireless, all of those things we've been looking at as a company and as a utility industry, really. So how do we bring all of that together? But most importantly, how do we bring back meter data? How do we bring back data from city and county plans? Every city, every county has a long-term plan. How do we use those to build back better? How do we use those to determine how we do our work in a specific area so that we can do work in Altadena, we can finish the rebuild and not have to come back to that city other than for outage mitigation for another 20 years? Right, so getting in front of what we know will be a long-term rebuild and a long-term electrification. How do we start doing some of those things now, get more efficient so that we don't disrupt customers 5, 10 years from now when we see this transition to more electrification, more in-home charging? The previous panel talked about heat pumps and all these other things that are going to be adopted. So really using that to our ability now, and as we forecast, to build what we need now so that we aren't disrupting customers and communities again with trenching and all these other things that are very disruptive to the customer. How do we do those things efficiently?
Thank you, Brandon. So I'm told that it's time to put it out for Q&A. So if you have any more conversation you want to have, there's a number. I don't know who's passing around microphones, but right there.
Hi, Dana. Hi, Dana Brofman. I have a question for you. Does your planning for the future, does it include, we're way overdue for a severe earthquake in this region. So does your planning include planning for the below ground water infrastructure as well as the above ground? I'm not sure what your discussions have to do with planning for the severe earthquake.
I think that goes to you, Shane.
Yeah, no, excellent question. Thank you for that. Short answer is constantly. We're constantly looking at that risk and strengthening the infrastructure and retrofitting the infrastructure as we learn more about the extent of that. And it's not just the infrastructure that we have to recognize we need to invest in. We have to make sure that we have the sufficient workforce that's trained to work under those kind of conditions and that understands emergency response and that understands how, as a utility, to work with fire services, to work with law enforcement. That's incredibly important. We're well geared to do that at Metropolitan. The larger water utilities, we go through these things all the time just because the scale of our service area, for the smaller water utilities, the large water utilities need to recognize that we're going to have to be there for them in an event like a major earthquake.
This question's for Shane as well. As I watched my community burn to the ground next to the ocean, it was almost comical because we're next to the largest body of water in the world. And I'm curious if there's been any studies done to look at using reverse osmosis plants and, minimal desal to, route water into the Santa Monica Mountains along Malibu or along the Wuhi perimeter there, or even for LA in general, to utilize this body of water that is next to us in the case of an emergency going forward.
It has been looked at and to some extent used by LA County and LA City Fire. They do use the ocean, conditions permitting, when the wind's not too high. And so they'll, you've seen the super scoopers, the yellow planes that'll go in. Those are very effective, the helicopters. As far as putting reverse osmosis on it for desalination, that's not necessary for firefighting. You could create a completely different system and utilize it that way. I know in the Malibu community, several other communities, there's been an investment in the helihydrants or the dip tanks for the helicopters to get water more quickly to slow the spread. But again, it's conditions permitting for that air fight.
Thank you. Maria Marani, Cordoba Corporation. My question is, I'm an infrastructure practitioner, and I understand that everything that you do has to do with infrastructure. And I understand that when a disaster happens, everybody wants to find the culprit. And of course, the utilities are there to be blamed for good reasons, and sometimes for not that good reasons. I understand that this transition that you're going to do from where we are to more sustainable infrastructure is going to take time, because these are large-scale engineered projects. How do we do conversion? First question is that, how do you see that to work with this and resist every problem that comes on your way and interface them in the time that you are trying to do the transition? Because this can happen next year or a year from now, and you guys are not going to still be ready. Question number one. And two is that, how do you work together, water and power and all this, how does this come together to create a whole new kind of infrastructure, which we understand is a long-term plan?
Want to try that, Scott?
I'll take a shot at it initially. Well, in terms of how we work together, I think, there's been some long-standing, processes between the utilities for communicating, especially in times of an emergency. But I think that's a little bit of a silver lining that's come out, not only of these unfortunate incidents, but COVID in general. It's forced us all to collaborate on a more regular basis, I would say. And, the regulations that are coming down, as I mentioned, joint trenching and things like that, those used to be used much less frequently than they are now. So those are kind of methodologies that the utilities are looking at as to how we can all collaborate, and as well as be less impactful on the communities. I'll turn it over to my co-panelists for some of the technologies that they're specifically utilizing. Fortunately, for the fiber industry in particular, the earthquakes don't pose as big a risk. There's a lot of flexibility in our conduit and things like that that allow, for it to absorb the energy when there's an earthquake. Water and power have a little more rigidity, I guess you could say, in their infrastructure. But it does affect things like data centers, right? So we don't need the data centers to go down. They all have backup power and other technologies there to ensure that they don't go down in times of emergency, because we all need, connectivity. We need that flow of information so that we can continue to respond and do our jobs. But, I'd like to turn it over to my other panelists and let them weigh in.
Brandon, why don't you take a shot at that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. One thing I'd like to see is, during times of crisis, we all come together really strongly, right? But when the crisis is 6, 8 months, 12 months away, we start to forget about how to do that, right? So really taking what we've learned and what we're going to continue to learn over the next few years, the rebuild is going to take a while. How do we expand that to everything that we do, right? We typically have challenges with permitting. There was a lot of leadership in the local and state levels that helped us push past that very quickly. Like, how do we learn from that, and how do we expand that to any infrastructure that we do? And then to Scott's point, how do we continue to coordinate as we have been doing? Even post-COVID, we were doing much better at that than pre-COVID, but there was still a lot to get better at. And this has really brought all the pieces together, not just the utilities, but the city, public works, regional planning. All of those have been critical for us to align. And then you throw in the Army Corps and all these other federal levels that have been involved as well. And if we can figure out how to package that up and continue to use that, we can get quicker at what we do. And that's, we can transform all the industries quickly, and we can minimize the impact to the customers of doing so, right? But it's not just an infrastructure solution in my mind. Your question earlier about AI and machine learning, that's software. There's hardware involved in that, but it's not a lot of hardware, right? It's a lot of computing power and things. So we've been thinking about that for years, is how do you have some centralized technologies that help you manage the grid better? And we've been doing that for 30 years now. We're on to our fourth, fifth generation of automated devices. So how do you continue to move those areas forward? And then finally, what I would say is, how are we helping customers be resilient themselves? There's a lot of technology out there that can help them do that. How do you get funding for them? How do you help them with what are large costs to do some of those things as they rebuild, as they remodel, thinking about not just the grid being reliable and resilient, whether it's the water, power, any of those grids, but also the consumer themselves, the customer, the Walmart, the Home Depot, all those. Some of those folks are already adopting resilient technologies for themselves. How do you make that more available to the broader public, essentially?
Thank you, Brandon. We have one more question over here, and then we have to, I see Kevin walking this way, so that means this is the last question. Go ahead, sir.
Yes, this is Ali Sahabi, Optimum Seismic. As a builder for almost 35 years, I want to commend you to have this collaboration and cooperation, because we all know the difficulty of coordinating all the utilities when we're building a project, even a residential home. With that in mind, I have two questions. One is, who is going to pay for all this rebuilding, building better and the new? And how is your planning prioritizing what areas are going to get this better infrastructure? And how long is this going to take?
Maria, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, I'd like to can I answer that a little slightly? So as we all talk about the coordination, also internally we kind of looked at ourselves, right? And I think we could all fairly say maybe the process was a little bit cumbersome. How can we streamline that? So we did develop a web page where everybody could just visit socalgas.com/wildfires, and it's a one-stop shop to what do developers, what do businesses, what do homeowners need to know to work with SoCal Gas? And we stand committed to support the community. If they're ready to build, we're ready for them. So I think we want to start with that coordination piece. Another piece that I wanted to talk about, wanted to mention a little bit prior to the infrastructure comment, was how do we coordinate? I think it's a little bit about speaking the same language, and these were real case scenarios where maybe the city, the county, and I can speak about SoCal Gas, well, how do you document where your outages are, where are the impacts to your system? And some of the conversations happen, well, why can't we all get on a GIS platform and communicate the same language? So I think some of those things came out. So to answer your question, from a SoCal Gas perspective, how are things going to get paid for? Through the CPUC, there's mechanisms that pay for when we reconnect service and the impacts of wildfires. But I'll also ask my co-panelists to just talk about individual rebuilding. They may have some additional comments.
So we're close to time, but what you just said effectively is you have a mechanism to pass on costs to ratepayers through the CPUC. Scott, can you talk to how do communications companies recover their costs?
Yeah, I know we don't have a lot of time, so I'll try and make it brief. But unlike my other panelists here, most of which are more monopolistic traditional utilities that, as Jesus mentioned, are regulated by the California Public Utilities Commission, and there are mechanisms within their charters and everything that allow them to go back to the ratepayers when they go through situations like they're currently in. The telcos, unfortunately, are in a slightly different situation. It's more of a competitive environment for them. They compete, and it's really the rebuilding is the costs will be absorbed by them. And that's one of the big issues that we're currently discussing with the regulatory agencies in the local cities is it's not inexpensive, but things like joint trenching and others are mechanisms to try and drive the costs down. But we're, as one company, looking at, several tens of millions of dollars to go back in now after the fact. So we were asked by the local jurisdictions to get in and rebuild our networks as quickly as possible, which we all did. But now we're being asked to which costs millions of dollars. But now we're looking at, now you're going to have to underground those utilities that you just rebuilt. So how are we going to go about paying for that? That's an open-ended question. There are potential opportunities to work with agencies at the state, federal, even the local level to maybe get some funds to help offset some of those costs. But to Jesus's point, we're looked at differently than the traditional utilities, and therefore have to self-fund most of these improvements.
So that's it for this panel. A hand of applause for these folks. Thank you so much. Great job. I'd love to go on and on, but I can't.